Hello, everyone. I know many of you listen while falling asleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. And don't forget to like and subscribe. Now, let's get comfortable, relax, and dive into tonight's case. June 5th, 1996, Rowlett, Texas. A quiet suburban community just outside Dallas where families felt safe, where children rode bikes down tree-lined streets, where neighbors knew each other by name. The kind of place where people move to escape the chaos of the city, to build lives filled with backyard barbecues and little league games. In the early morning darkness of that Wednesday, in a modest two-story home on Eagle Drive, a nightmare was unfolding that would shatter that sense of security forever. At 2:31 a.m., a frantic 911 call pierced the silence of the Rowlett Police Department's emergency line. A woman's voice, breathless and panicked, screamed into the receiver. The dispatcher's calm questions met with chaos on the other end. Crying, screaming, words tumbling over each other in a torrent of terror. The address came through 5815 Eagle Drive. The caller identified herself as Darlie Routier. She was screaming that someone had broken into her home, that her babies had been stabbed, that she needed help immediately. The recording of that call would be played thousands of times in courtrooms, on television programs and documentaries. Every inflection analyzed, every breath scrutinized, every word weighed for sincerity or deception. But in that moment, as police units and ambulances raced through the empty streets of Rowlett, there was only urgency. 2 children were dying. A mother was screaming for help. And somewhere in that house on Eagle Drive, the truth about what happened in those dark morning hours waited to be discovered. Darlie Lynn Routier was 26 years old that summer. Born Darlie Lynn Peck in Altoona, Pennsylvania. She had moved to Texas as a teenager when her mother remarried. She was described by those who knew her as vivacious, outgoing, a woman who loved to laugh and be the center of attention. She had long dark hair that she took pride in styling, preferred glamorous makeup, and enjoyed dressing fashionably. Some saw her as fun-loving and generous. Others whispered that she was vain, materialistic, more concerned with appearances than substance. The truth, as with most people, likely existed somewhere between these extremes. At 15, Darlie met Darren Routier at a restaurant in Lubbock where she was working as a waitress. Darren was 3 years older, already establishing himself in the world of electronics and business. He was ambitious, driven, a young man who saw opportunities everywhere and wasn't afraid to chase them. Darlie was drawn to his confidence, his plans for the future, his certainty that he would make something of himself. He was drawn to her beauty, her energy, her ability to light up a room when she walked into it. They began dating, and despite their youth, the relationship moved quickly. They married in August of 1988, when Darlie was just 18 years old. It was a small ceremony, nothing extravagant, but it represented big dreams. Darren had ambitions of building a successful business. Darlie wanted a family, a beautiful home, the kind of life she had imagined for herself. In those early years, it seemed like everything was falling into place exactly as they had hoped. Their first son, Devon Rush Routier, was born in June of 1989. Darren and Darlie were young parents, still teenagers themselves when they brought their first child into the world, but they threw themselves into parenthood with enthusiasm. Devon was a beautiful baby, and as he grew, he became a bright, energetic boy with an infectious smile. 2 years later, in October of 1991, their second son arrived. Damon Christian Root joined the family, and the household grew louder, busier, more chaotic in the way that homes with young children always are. Darren's business ventures were succeeding. He had started Tesnik, a company that tested electronic circuit boards, and it was growing steadily. Money was coming in. The Routiers were able to afford things that many young couples could only dream about. In 1992, they purchased the home on Eagle Drive in Rowlett. It was a beautiful house, 2 stories, 2,500 square feet, with a swimming pool in the backyard. It had a formal living room, a family room, a kitchen with an island, 3 bedrooms upstairs. It was the kind of home that said success, that said we've made it. Darlie decorated the house with care, choosing furnishings that were both comfortable and stylish. She kept the home clean, took pride in its appearance. The backyard became a gathering place for neighborhood children. The pool a summertime attraction. From the outside, the Routiers looked like they were living the American dream. Young, attractive, successful, with two beautiful sons and a lovely home. Friends and neighbors saw a family that seemed blessed. In October of 1995, the family grew again. Drake Whittier was born, a third son, completing the family. Now they had 3 boys. Devin, who was 7, Damon, who was 5, and baby Drake. The house was filled with the sounds of childhood, with laughter and arguments and the constant motion of young boys. Darlie had her hands full managing 3 children, but she seemed to embrace the chaos. She posted photos of the boys, dressed them in matching outfits for pictures, celebrated their birthdays with elaborate parties. Devon and Damon were close, as brothers near in age often are. They played together, shared a room upstairs in the Eagle Drive house. Devon was the older brother, protective and responsible, already showing signs of the kind of man he might have become. He was doing well in school, had friends in the neighborhood, loved sports and outdoor activities. Damon was more sensitive, more prone to tears when hurt or upset, but equally full of life and energy. The two of them were inseparable, a matched set, always together. That spring of 1996, as the Texas heat began to build toward summer, life in the Routier household continued its familiar rhythms. Darren worked long hours at Tesnick, building his business, chasing bigger contracts, always looking for the next opportunity. Darlie managed the home and children, a full-time job in itself with 3 boys under the age of 7. To the outside world, they continued to project success and happiness. But beneath the surface, cracks were beginning to show. The truth was that Darren's business, despite its early success, was struggling. The economy was shifting, contracts were harder to come by, and money that had once flowed freely was beginning to tighten. The Routiers had lived well, perhaps too well, spending money on luxuries and upgrades and maintaining a lifestyle that reflected success. Now, with income decreasing and bills mounting, financial pressure was building. Darlie felt the stress acutely. She had grown accustomed to having nice things, to being able to buy what she wanted it. The idea of cutting back, of admitting that they couldn't afford their lifestyle anymore, was difficult for her to accept. There were arguments about money, about spending, about priorities. Darren tried to reassure her that it was temporary, that the business would pick up again, but the worry gnawed at both of them. Friends noticed changes in Darlie that spring. She seemed more tired, more irritable. The sparkle that usually animated her seemed dimmed. She talked about feeling overwhelmed, about struggling to keep up with the demands of 3 children, about missing the freedom she had before motherhood consumed her life. Some of these feelings were normal, the kind of exhaustion that every parent of children experiences at some point. But there were hints of something deeper, a dissatisfaction that went beyond ordinary tiredness. She began talking about getting breast augmentation surgery. It was something she had wanted for years, a way to feel better about her body after 3 pregnancies. In early June, she scheduled a consultation. Darren supported the decision, saw it as something that would make her happy, help her feel more confident. The surgery was booked for later that summer. It was one bright spot on the horizon, something to look forward to. On June 4, 1996, a Tuesday, the day unfolded normally. It was hot, the kind of oppressive Texas heat that makes you grateful for air conditioning. Darren went to work. Darlie stayed home with the boys. Devin had just finished 1st grade. Damon had completed kindergarten. Summer vacation stretched ahead of them, weeks of freedom from school schedules and homework. That evening, Darren came home around 6:30. The family had dinner together. Nothing fancy, just a regular Tuesday night meal. Afterward, the boys played while Darlie cleaned up the kitchen. Darren mentioned that he had work to do, paperwork and planning for Tesnick that needed his attention. He went upstairs to the computer in their bedroom to focus on business matters. Darlie decided to let Devin and Damon sleep downstairs in the family room that night. It was something the boys enjoyed doing occasionally, a special treat like camping indoors. She made up a sleeping area for them on the floor near the couch. Devin brought down his pillow and a blanket. Damon did the same, and giggling as they settled into their makeshift beds. Baby Drake was already asleep upstairs in his crib in the nursery. The family room where the boys would sleep was spacious and comfortable. It had a large sectional couch, a television, a coffee table. French doors opened onto the patio and backyard. Windows along one wall looked out toward the side yard. The room connected to the kitchen through a wide opening. It was the heart of the home, the place where the family spent most of their time together. Around 9:30 p.m., Darlie got the boys settled down for sleep. She turned off most of the lights, leaving just a small lamp on in the kitchen. Devin and Damon were in their sleeping area near the couch. Darlie lay down on the couch herself, planning to watch some television before going upstairs to bed. It was a warm night, and the house was quiet except for the hum of the air conditioner. Darren was still upstairs working. He would later say that he worked until sometime after midnight, then finally shut down the computer and went to the bedroom to sleep. Drake was in his crib in the nursery, sleeping soundly. Devin and Damon were on the floor in the family room, their breathing steady and deep in sleep. Darlie was on the couch, drifting in and out of consciousness as the television played quietly. The house settled into the stillness of night. The neighborhood around Eagle Drive was dark and peaceful. Most families were asleep, houses locked up and secure. Street lights cast pools of yellow illumination onto empty sidewalks. No one was awake to see or hear anything unusual. The early morning hours ticked by quietly, 1 a.m., 2 a.m. The darkest part of night, when sleep is deepest and the world seems suspended in silence. And then, in those dark hours before dawn, something happened in the house on Eagle Drive that would change everything forever. The timeline would later be reconstructed minute by minute, second by second, analyzed and debated endlessly. But in the moment, it was chaos and confusion and terror. Darlie would later say that she woke up to someone or something on top of her, attacking her. She said she saw a man in the family room, a shadowy figure, and that she struggled with him. She said she saw him moving away toward the kitchen and utility room. She said she realized the boys had been hurt. She said she screamed for Darren. The first concrete, verifiable moment in the timeline is the 911 call at 2:31 a.m. Darlie's voice on that recording is the first solid evidence of what was happening in the house. Everything before that moment would have to be pieced together from physical evidence, from blood patterns and wounds, and the position of bodies and objects. Everything before that call exists only in Darlie's account of what happened, and that account would become the central question in everything that followed. On the 911 recording, Darlie is screaming. Her voice is high-pitched, frantic, breaking with sobs. She tells the dispatcher that someone came in and stabbed her and her children. She says she fought with him. She says her boys are dying. The dispatcher tries to calm her down, tries to get clear information about the situation, about whether the intruder is still in the house, about the condition of the victims. "My babies are dying," Darlie screams.
"They're dead."
The dispatcher asks if they're breathing. Darlie says she doesn't know. There's commotion in the background. More screaming, the sound of movement. Then Darren's voice appears on the recording. He has come downstairs, awakened by Darlie's screams. He takes in the scene in the family room and his voice joins the chaos. "What happened?" he shouts. Darlie tells him someone broke in and attacked them. Darren begins performing CPR on Devin, trying desperately to save his son. On the 911 recording, you can hear him breathing into Devin's mouth, counting compressions, his voice tight with panic but trying to maintain control. The dispatcher talks him through it, tells him to keep going, that help is on the way. The recording lasts 5 minutes and 44 seconds. It is 5 minutes and 44 seconds of raw, unfiltered horror. Parents discovering their children have been stabbed, desperate attempts to save them, screaming and crying and pleading. When the recording ends, police and ambulances are pulling up to the house on Eagle Drive. Officer David Waddell was the first police officer to arrive on scene. He pulled up at 2:37 a.m., just 6 minutes after the 911 call began. He approached the house cautiously, not knowing if the attacker was still inside, not knowing what he was walking into. He could see lights on inside, could hear sounds of distress even from outside. He came through the front door and immediately saw carnage. Blood, everywhere blood. In the family room, on the floor near the kitchen, smeared on surfaces, pooled in dark puddles. Two small boys lying motionless. A woman standing in the kitchen, blood, her nightshirt saturated with it. A man kneeling next to one of the boys, performing CPR, his hands and arms covered in blood. Officer Waddell's training kicked in. He needed to assess the scene, determine if there was still danger, call for backup, help the victims. He moved into the house, his hand on his weapon, eyes scanning for threats. He asked Darlie what happened. She told him an intruder had attacked them. She pointed toward the utility room, saying he went that way. She was holding a towel to her neck. Blood was running down her chest and arm. More officers arrived within minutes. Sergeant Matthew Walling, Officer James Froch. The house filled with first responders, all trying to manage the chaos. Paramedics rushed in with equipment, moving immediately to the boys. Devon and Damon were both still lying where they had been attacked, their small bodies surrounded by blood. Devon was near the family room entrance. Damon had moved slightly, evidence suggesting he had tried to get up or crawl before collapsing again. The paramedics worked frantically. They assessed the boys quickly, and the news was devastating. Devon had no pulse, no respiration. He had suffered multiple stab wounds to his chest and back. The wounds were deep, catastrophic. One had penetrated his lung. He had lost massive amounts of blood. The paramedics tried to revive him, but there was nothing they could do. Devon Rush Routier, 7 years old, was dead. Damon was still alive, but barely. He had been stabbed multiple times in the back and chest. His wounds were severe, life-threatening. The paramedics intubated him, did everything they could to stabilize him for transport. He was unconscious, his small body broken and bleeding. They loaded him onto a stretcher and rushed him to the ambulance. The race to the hospital began, sirens wailing as they sped through the empty pre-dawn streets. Darlie was also injured. She had a slash wound across her neck, cutting through the skin but not deep enough to hit major arteries or her windpipe. She had a stab wound on her right arm. She had bruising beginning to form on her arms. The paramedics examined her injuries and determined that while they were serious, they were not immediately life-threatening. She needed treatment, needed stitches, needed observation. But she could walk and talk and was conscious and alert. Darren was physically unharmed, though in a state of shock and disbelief. He had been asleep upstairs when the attack occurred, had heard nothing until Darlie's screams woke him. He had rushed downstairs to find his 2 oldest sons bleeding to death and his wife wounded. Now Devon was dead on the family room floor, and Damon was being rushed to the hospital with injuries that might kill him too. Officer Waddell secured the scene as best he could while chaos still reigned. He noted the position of the bodies, the blood patterns, the layout of the house. He looked for evidence of forced entry, for signs of an intruder, for anything would explain what had happened here. The utility room door that led to the garage was standing open. Darlie had said the intruder went that way. Officers checked the garage and found door to the backyard also open. In the kitchen, on the countertop near the island, a large bread knife lay on the counter. Its blade was covered in blood. Nearby was a vacuum cleaner that appeared to have been knocked over or displaced. On the floor throughout the family room and kitchen was shattered glass from a wine glass that had been on the coffee table. Blood was smeared and pooled everywhere, making it difficult to walk without stepping in it. Sergeant Walling made the decision to transport Darlie to the hospital as well. Her neck wound needed treatment, and she needed to be examined thoroughly to assess all her injuries. An ambulance took her to Baylor University Medical Center, the same hospital where Damon had been taken. Darren rode with her, still in shock, still covered in Devon's blood from his attempts at CPR. At the hospital, doctors examined Darlie's wounds. The cut across approximately 4.5 inches long. It had sliced through skin and tissue, but had miraculously missed the carotid artery, the jugular vein, and her windpipe. A fraction of an inch deeper or in a slightly different position, and it could have been fatal. As it was, it required careful cleaning and stitching. The wand on her arm also needed sutures. She had bruising on her arms that would become more pronounced over the next 24 hours. While doctors worked on Darlie, other doctors were fighting to save Damon. The 5-year-old boy had suffered multiple stab wounds. One had penetrated his liver. Another had punctured his lung. He had lost enormous amounts of blood. The trauma team worked desperately, but his injuries were too severe. Damon Christian Rudier died at approximately 6:09 a.m., less than 4 hours after the attack. He had fought for his life, had clung to it with everything a 5-year-old body could muster, but in the end, the wounds were too much. 2 boys dead, 2 bright, beautiful children who had gone to sleep on the floor of their family room as a special treat, excited about summer vacation, their whole lives ahead of them. Gone, stabbed to death in their own home in the dark early morning hours. It was incomprehensible, horrifying, the kind of tragedy that shakes entire communities. When news of Damon's death reached Darlie and Darren at the hospital, the grief was overwhelming. Darlie wailed, screamed, collapsed in anguish. Darren sobbed, unable to process that both of his older sons were gone. Medical staff tried to comfort them, but there was no comfort to be found. Their children were dead. Their lives were destroyed. Nothing would ever be the same. Back at the house on Eagle Drive, the Rowlett Police Department was beginning the massive task of processing what was clearly a crime scene of enormous complexity. Devon's body still lay in the family room, covered now, but requiring careful documentation before it could be moved. Every surface needed to be photographed, every blood drop cataloged, every piece of potential evidence collected and preserved. Detective Jimmy Patterson arrived to take lead on the investigation. He walked through the house slowly, carefully, taking in every detail. The scene was shocking even to experienced investigators. The amount of blood was staggering. It was on the floors, the walls, the furniture. It was smeared and dripped and pooled. It told a story. But what story? That was the question that would drive the investigation. The layout of the crime scene raised immediate questions. If an intruder had entered the house, how had he gotten in? The front door had been locked. The only unlocked entrance was through the garage, which Darlie said the intruder had used to escape. But there was no sign of forced entry, no broken windows, no jimmied locks, no damage to doors or frames. An intruder would have had to have known that the garage door was unlocked and would provide access to the house. The murder weapon appeared to be the bread knife found on the kitchen counter. It was a knife from the Rotier's own kitchen, from the knife block that sat on the counter. This raised another question. Why would an intruder use a knife from the house rather than bringing his own weapon? It suggested either opportunity, or that the attacker was familiar with the house layout. The blood evidence would prove crucial to understanding what happened. Analysts would later spend months examining blood patterns, blood drops, blood smears. Whose blood was where? How did it get there? What did the patterns indicate about movement and timing? Blood evidence can tell investigators an enormous amount about the sequence of events in a violent crime, and this scene had blood evidence in abundance. In the kitchen there was blood in the sink. Drops of blood leading from the family room to the kitchen. Smears on the countertop, Darlie's blood. Later testing would confirm. The location and pattern of this blood would become extremely significant as the investigation progressed, raising questions about what Darlie had been doing in the moments after the attack. There was also the question of the sock. In an alley about 75 yards from the Rudier house, police would soon discover a white tube sock with blood on it. The sock would later be tested and found to contain both Darlie's blood and Damon's blood. How did the sock get into the alley? Why was it there? Darlie would say the intruder must have taken it, must have dropped it as he fled. But the presence of that sock in that location would raise more questions than it answered. The screen in the utility room window had been cut. There was a slash in the screen material, about 4 inches long. Darlie said this was how the intruder had entered, cutting the screen to gain access. But investigators examining the cut had questions. The screen appeared to have been cut from the inside, not the outside. The dust and debris on the windowsill had not been disturbed in a way consistent with someone climbing through. There were no shoe prints, no dirt tracked in. No indication that anyone had actually used this window as an entry point. As detectives processed the scene, They began to feel a growing unease about Darley's account of events. Small details weren't adding up. The lack of forced entry. The use of a knife from the house. The blood patterns that didn't seem to match the story of an intruder attack. The cut screen that looked staged. The sock in the alley that seemed placed rather than dropped. None of these things were conclusive on their own, but together they created a picture that troubled investigators. By mid-morning on June 6th, the crime scene processing was still ongoing. Dozens of photos had been taken. Evidence was being collected and bagged. Devon's body had been carefully removed and transported to the medical examiner's office for autopsy. The house was a mess of fingerprint dust and evidence markers, and the lingering smell of blood. Darren's sister and her husband had come to take care of baby Drake, who had slept through everything and was safe and unharmed. Relatives were gathering, trying to provide support, trying to make sense of the senseless. The neighborhood was in shock. News trucks were beginning to arrive as word of the murders spread. A quiet suburban street had become the site of a double homicide, and everyone wanted to know what had happened. Darley and Darren were still at the hospital, dealing with their injuries and their grief. Darley had been treated and stitched up. Her wounds were painful but would heal. The wounds to her heart and mind were another matter entirely. She kept asking why, kept trying to understand how this could have happened. Darren was similarly devastated, barely able to function through his grief. Detectives needed to interview both of them thoroughly. They needed to hear Darley's account of what happened in detail. They needed to ask questions, probe for information, understand the timeline. In the immediate aftermath of such trauma, it was difficult but necessary. Memories fade and change over time. Details get confused or lost. The sooner investigators could get comprehensive statements, the better. Detective Patterson and Sergeant Walling went to the hospital to interview Darley. She was in a hospital bed, bandaged, her face drawn with grief and shock. They expressed condolences for her loss and then gently began asking questions. Darley told them her story. She said she had been asleep on the couch in the family room. Devon and Damon were on the floor near her. She woke up to something on top of her, pressing down on her. She fought back, struggling. She saw a man, couldn't see his face clearly, but he was there in the room. She said she saw him go toward the utility room and garage. She said she realized the boys had been hurt. She said she saw blood everywhere. She screamed for Darren and called 911. The detectives asked for more details. What did the intruder look like? Darley said she couldn't see him well. It was dark. Everything happened so fast. She thought he was wearing dark clothes, maybe a baseball cap, but she couldn't be sure. She couldn't identify any specific features. How did he get in? Darley said he must have come through the garage, through the utility room. The door to the garage was usually locked, but maybe she had forgotten to lock it that night. She wasn't sure. Everything was confused. Did she hear anything before she woke up? Any sounds of the intruder entering or moving around? Darley said no, asleep, and the next thing she knew, he was on top of her, attacking her. The detectives noted her responses, filed away the information. Some of it made sense. Some of it raised questions. They would need to compare her account to the physical evidence, see if everything matched up. That would take time, would require careful analysis. An autopsy was performed on Devon's body that day. The medical examiner documented his injuries in detail. Devon had been stabbed 4 times. One wound had penetrated his chest, cutting through the rib cage and into the lung. Another had struck him in the back. The wounds were deep, made with significant force. The knife had been driven into his small body with power and violence. He had also sustained wounds to his hands. Defensive wounds that indicated he had tried to protect himself, tried to fight back against his attacker. The medical examiner determined that Devon had died from his stab wounds, from blood loss and the catastrophic damage to his internal organs. He would have lost consciousness quickly, would have bought out within minutes. It was a brutal, violent death for a 7-year-old boy. Damon's autopsy would follow soon after. Like his brother, Damon had been stabbed multiple times. He had wounds in his back and chest. One had penetrated his liver. One had collapsed his lung. He had defensive wounds on his hands as well, showing that he too had tried to protect himself. The medical examiner noted that Damon had survived longer than Devon, had fought harder to stay alive. But ultimately his injuries were too severe. The autopsies provided crucial information about the nature of the attack. The wounds were deep and forceful. They had been inflicted with a large knife, consistent with the bread knife found in the kitchen. The pattern and location of the wounds suggested that the attacker had struck multiple times, continuing to stab even after the boys were down and dying. It was a frenzied, vicious attack. The news of the murder spread quickly through Rowlett and the surrounding Dallas suburbs. 2 young boys stabbed to death in their home in the middle of the night. Their mother wounded, claiming an intruder had attacked them. It was the kind of story that captured immediate attention. That sparked fear in parents everywhere. If this could happen in a quiet neighborhood like Eagle Drive, it could happen anywhere. Local news stations ran the story prominently. Reporters gathered outside the Routier house, filming the crime scene tape and the police vehicles that remained parked in the driveway. Neighbors were interviewed, expressing shock and grief. Everyone who knew the family described Devon and Damon as sweet boys full of life. No one could understand why anyone would hurt them. In those first days after the murders, public sympathy was entirely with Darlie and Darren. They were seen as victims of a terrible crime, parents who had lost their children in the most horrific way imaginable. The community rallied around them. Friends organized meal deliveries, offered to help with funeral arrangements, provided whatever support they could. A fund was set up to help with expenses. Donations poured in from people who wanted to do something, anything, to help this grieving family. Darlie and Darren returned home on June 7th, the day after the murders. The house had been released by police, though it still bore the marks of the crime. The carpet in the family room was saturated with blood that had dried to a dark brown stain. The smell of blood and death lingered in the air. The family room where the boys had died was a place of horror now, impossible to enter without seeing it all over again. They couldn't stay there. The house held too many memories, too much pain. Darren's parents offered to let them stay in their home. Darlie, Darren, and baby Drake out of the Eagle Drive house, leaving behind the scene of the tragedy. But they would have to return eventually to gather belongings, to deal with the aftermath, to somehow figure out how to move forward with their lives shattered. The funerals were planned for June 10th. It was decided that Devon and Damon would be buried together, side by side, in the Wrestling Funeral Home and Cemetery in Dallas. The service would be at the funeral home with burial to follow. Family and friends began making arrangements, choosing caskets, selecting flowers, writing obituaries. All the unbearable tasks that come with death. Darlie was struggling enormously with her grief. Friends who saw her in those days said she seemed to be in shock, unable to fully process what had happened. At times she would cry inconsolably. At other times she would seem almost detached, as if her mind couldn't accept the reality of her son's deaths. She talked about them in the present tense sometimes, as if they were still alive. It was a mother's mind trying to protect itself from unbearable truth. Darren was drowning in his own grief and guilt. He had been upstairs asleep when his sons were killed. He hadn't heard anything, hadn't protected them, hadn't been there when they needed him. The weight of that knowledge was crushing. He held baby Drake close, terrified that something might happen to his youngest son, unable to shake the fear that danger still lurked. The police investigation continued intensively. Detective Patterson and his team were working around the clock, following every lead, examining every piece of evidence. They interviewed neighbors, asking if anyone had seen or heard anything unusual in the early morning hours of June 6th. Most had heard nothing. A few reported hearing a dog barking around that time, but that wasn't particularly unusual. No one reported seeing a stranger in the neighborhood. Officers canvassed the area looking for the murder weapon's origin point and any other evidence. They searched storm drains, vacant lots, dumpsters. They were looking for anything the intruder might have discarded as he fled. They were looking for footprints, tire tracks, anything that would indicate someone had been in the area who didn't belong there. The sock found in the alley continued to puzzle investigators. It was a tube sock, white, unremarkable except for the blood on it. Testing confirmed it contained Darley's blood and Damon's blood. How had it gotten 75 yards from the house? The most obvious explanation, according to Darley's account, was that the intruder had grabbed it during the attack and dropped it as he ran away. But why would an intruder take a sock? And if he did take it, why drop it in the alley instead of taking it with him or discarding it further away? Some investigators began to develop a different theory about the sock. They theorized that someone from inside the house had placed it there, deliberately, to create evidence of an intruder fleeing the scene. It would explain why the sock was there but not discarded more carefully. It would explain why it seemed staged rather than naturally dropped. But this theory had disturbing implications, because it suggested that someone in the house was involved in the murders. The blood evidence was being analyzed in detail by forensic specialists. They were mapping every drop, every smear, every pool of blood. They were determining whose blood was where, using DNA testing to distinguish between Darley's blood, Devon's blood, and Damon's blood. They were examining the patterns the blood made when it dripped, when it was smeared, when it transferred from one surface to another. In the kitchen, the blood evidence was particularly interesting. There were drops of Darley's blood in the sink and on the counter near the sink. The pattern and location of these drops suggested that Darley had stood at the sink, bleeding from her neck wound, while blood dripped down. But when had this happened? In Darley's account of events, she had been attacked, had seen the intruder, had realized the boys were hurt, and had immediately called 911. There was no mention of standing at the sink. So why was her blood there in that pattern? There was also blood evidence that suggested movement through the house that didn't match Darley's story. Blood trails, blood transfers, the timing and sequence of when different blood was deposited. The forensic analysts were building a timeline based on the blood evidence, and that timeline was raising questions about whether Darley's account of events could be accurate. The knife found on the kitchen counter was tested extensively. It was confirmed to be the murder weapon. Blood on the blade matched the victim's. The knife had come from the routier's own knife block, which sat on the kitchen counter. An intruder using a knife from the house was possible, but seemed less likely than an intruder bringing his own weapon. It suggested familiarity with the house, knowledge of where the knives were kept. Detectives also examined the cut screen in the utility room window more closely. They brought in specialists to analyze the cut, to determine the direction and method used to create it. The specialists concluded that the screen had been cut from the inside, not the outside. The edges of the cut, the way the material was displaced, all indicated that a knife had been pushed through from inside the room toward the outside. This was significant because it contradicted the theory that an intruder had cut the screen to gain entry. If the screen was cut from the inside, it suggested staging, an attempt to create false evidence of a break-in, combined with the lack of any other evidence of forced entry, the lack of disturbance to the dust and debris on the windowsill, and the absence of footprints or other signs of someone climbing through. The cut screen began to look very much like a staged piece of evidence. By June 8th, just 2 days after the murders, the investigation was beginning to shift focus. While detectives were still pursuing the possibility of an intruder, they were also looking more carefully at the possibility that the crime had been committed by someone inside the house. The evidence was pointing in that direction more strongly with each passing hour. Darley and Darren were asked to come to the police station for additional interviews. They agreed, wanting to cooperate, wanting to help find whoever had killed their sons. Darren was interviewed first. He recounted his actions on the night of June 5th and early morning of June 6th. He had been working on the computer upstairs until sometime after midnight. He had then gone to bed in the master bedroom. He had heard nothing unusual. He had been asleep when Darley screamed, waking him around 2:30 a.m. He had run downstairs and found the horrific scene. Detectives asked Darren about the family's finances, about his relationship with Darley, about whether there were any problems at home. Darren admitted that money had been tight recently, that the business wasn't doing as well as it had been. But he insisted that things weren't desperate, that they were managing. He said his marriage was solid, that he and Darlie loved each other and their children. He couldn't imagine anyone wanting to hurt his family. When asked if he thought Darlie could have been involved in the murders, Darren became emotional. He said absolutely not, that Darlie loved the boys, that she would never hurt them. He said she had been injured too, that she had almost died herself. The idea that she could be responsible was impossible to him. Darlie's interview was longer and more detailed. She went through her account of events again, trying to remember more details, trying to help the investigation. But as detectives pressed her on specific points, inconsistencies began to emerge. Small details that changed between tellings. Timelines that didn't quite match up. Descriptions that were vague or contradictory. The detectives asked her about her movements after the attack. Had she moved around the house? Had she gone to the kitchen? Darlie said she didn't remember clearly. Everything was chaos. She was screaming, trying to help the boys, calling 911. She might have moved around, she wasn't sure. They asked about the sock in the alley. Did she know how it got there? Darlie said the intruder must have taken it. The detectives asked why an intruder would take a sock. Darlie said she didn't know. Maybe he used it to avoid leaving fingerprints. Maybe he grabbed it by accident. She couldn't explain it. They asked about the lack of forced entry. How did the intruder get in? Darlie said maybe through the garage. Maybe she had forgotten to lock the door. The detectives noted that she had originally said the door was usually locked but might not have been that night. Now she seemed less certain. The interview went on for hours. Darlie was tired, grieving, medicated for pain from her injuries. She struggled to answer questions coherently at times. The detectives could see her frustration and exhaustion, but they needed answers. They needed to understand what had really happened in that house. By the end of the interview, the detectives' suspicions had deepened. Darlie's story had too many holes, too many inconsistencies. The physical evidence didn't support her account of an intruder attack. The staging of the crime scene suggested someone trying to create a false narrative. And the only people in the house that night were Darlie, Darren, and the children. On June 10th, the funeral for Devon and Damon was held. Hundreds of people attended, filling the funeral home to capacity and spilling out into the parking lot. The grief was overwhelming, palpable. 2 small white caskets sat at the front of the room, surrounded by flowers. Photos of the boys were displayed, showing their bright smiles, their joy in life. It was unbearable to look at those smiles and know that these children were gone forever. Darlie was heavily sedated, barely able to function through her grief. She wore sunglasses to hide her tears, leaned on Darren for support. Friends and family surrounded them, trying to provide comfort. The service included eulogies, prayers, hymns. People spoke about Devon's kindness, Damon's sensitivity, the light they had brought into the world. There wasn't a dry eye in the room. After the service, the caskets were transported to the cemetery for burial. Devon and Damon were laid to rest side by side under the Texas sun. Darlie collapsed at the graveside, overcome. Darren held her up, his own face a mask of anguish. Baby Drake was there, too young to understand that his brothers were gone forever. The funeral should have been the beginning of healing, the first step toward finding a way to live with unimaginable loss. But for the Rowlett Police Department, it was just another day in an investigation that was moving in a direction the family never expected. The day after the funeral, on June 11th, Darlie and Darren returned to the cemetery. It was Devon's 7th birthday. He should have been celebrating with cake and presents and friends. Instead, his mother was standing at his grave, trying to comprehend that he was really gone. Darlie had brought birthday gifts to the cemetery, toys and cards that Devon would never see. She left them at the gravesite, a heartbreaking gesture of a mother's love that had nowhere to go. But Darlie and family members did more than just mourn at the cemetery that day. They held what could only be described as a birthday party at the gravesite. They sprayed silly string on the grave, laughing and smiling as they did. They took photos. They seemed to outside observers almost celebratory. It was a strange scene, one that didn't fit the expected behavior of a grieving mother, just one day after burying her murdered children. What Darlie and her family saw as a celebration of Devon's life, a way to honor his birthday in the only way they could now, others interpreted very differently. Someone recorded the silly string celebration on video. That video would soon make its way to the police and eventually to the media. And when people saw it, when they watched Darlie laughing and spraying silly string on her son's grave, their perception of her began to shift dramatically. The video seemed to show a woman who wasn't grieving appropriately, who was behaving in a way that seemed callous or even celebratory after her children's deaths. It didn't matter that the video didn't show the hours of crying that came before and after. It didn't matter that different people grieve in different ways. What mattered was the optics, and the optics were terrible. Detective Patterson saw the video, and it reinforced his growing suspicions about Darlie. A mother who could laugh and smile at her murdered child's grave, just days after his death, seemed to him like a mother who might be capable of killing that child. It was not proof, not evidence in any legal sense, but it shaped his perception and the perception of other investigators. The investigation was now focusing almost exclusively on Darlie. Detectives began digging into her background, her psychological state, her relationship with her children. They interviewed friends and neighbors, asking about Darlie's behavior, her moods, her parenting. They were building a profile, looking for evidence that she might be capable of murder. Some of what they heard painted a picture of a woman who struggled with the demands of motherhood. Friends mentioned that Darlie sometimes seemed overwhelmed by the boys, frustrated by the noise and chaos that 3 young children created. She had talked about wanting her old life back, about missing the freedom she had before kids. She had mentioned feeling like she had lost her identity in motherhood. These feelings were not unusual. Many parents, especially mothers, feel overwhelmed and frustrated at times. It's a normal part of parenting young children. But in the context of a murder investigation, these normal feelings were being interpreted as potential motive. If Darlie resented her children, if she felt trapped by motherhood, might she have killed them to escape? Other friends defended Darlie strongly. They said she loved her boys, that she was a devoted mother despite normal moments of frustration. They said the idea that she could hurt her children was absurd. They pointed to the many photos of Darlie with the boys, the elaborate birthday parties she threw, the care she took in dressing them and documenting their lives. This was not the behavior of a mother who wanted to be rid of her children. The financial investigation revealed that the Routiers were indeed struggling with money. Darren's business had significant debts. They owed money on credit cards, were behind on some bills. They had been living beyond their means for some time, and now the bills were coming due. But financial stress is common and rarely leads to murder. Thousands of families struggle with money without anyone getting killed. Was it really a motive for a mother to stab her own children to death? Investigators also looked into the Routiers' insurance policies. They discovered that Darlie and Darren had life insurance policies on the children. The policies weren't huge, around $5,000 per child, enough to cover funeral expenses but not enough to be a significant financial windfall. Still, the existence of insurance policies on the murdered children would later be used to suggest financial motive, even though the amounts were relatively small. The forensic analysis of the crime scene was completed by mid-June. The final reports confirmed what investigators had begun to suspect. The blood evidence did not support Darlie's account of being attacked by an intruder while lying on the couch. The pattern and location of blood drops suggested she had been moving around the house, had been at the kitchen sink, had interacted with various surfaces in ways that didn't match her story. There was cast-off blood spatter, tiny drops of blood that are flung from a bloody weapon when it's raised and swung. This spatter was found on Darlie's nightshirt in patterns, consistent with someone wielding the knife in a stabbing motion. The location and pattern of this spatter suggested that Darlie had been holding the knife when the boys were stabbed. Darlie's nightshirt was examined in minute detail. It was a white cotton nightshirt that had been saturated with blood. Much of the blood was from transfer, from contact with the bleeding children. But there was also blood evidence that was more troubling. Small drops and spatters in locations that suggested Darlie had been the one holding the knife, the one inflicting the wounds. There was also the matter of Darlie's wounds. The slash across her throat and the stab wound on her arm were real injuries that had required medical treatment. But medical examiners looking at photos and reports began to question whether these were defensive wounds from fighting an attacker, or whether they might be self-inflicted. The neck wound was superficial despite being dramatic looking. It had bled profusely as head and neck wounds do, but it had carefully avoided all the vital structures in the neck. The carotid artery, which would cause death in minutes if severed, was untouched. The jugular vein, which would cause rapid bleeding out, was untouched. The windpipe was untouched. For someone slashing at another person's throat, that would be extremely lucky. For someone carefully cutting their own throat to create appearance of being attacked, it would make perfect sense. The wound on Darlie's arm was also examined. It was consistent with a defensive wound, but it could also be consistent with a self-inflicted wound. The angle, the depth, the location, all could go either way. Without witnessing how the wound was created, it was impossible to say definitively. But combined with the neck wound and all the other evidence, investigators were becoming convinced that Darlie had cut herself. The bruising on Darlie's arms was photographed and documented. Bruises take time to develop and darken, so photos taken at different times showed the progression. The bruises were real, but how she got them remained a question. She said they came from fighting with the intruder. Investigators theorized she might have inflicted them herself by striking her arms against something, creating the appearance of struggle. By the end of June, the Rowlett Police Department had concluded their investigation. They believed they knew what had happened in the house on Eagle Drive on June 6th. They believed that Darlie Routier had murdered her own children and then injured herself to make it look like an intruder attack. They believed the evidence's conclusion overwhelmingly. On June 18th, 12 days after the murders, Darlie Routier was arrested and charged with capital murder in the deaths of Devon and Damon Routier. Police came to the home where she was staying and took her into custody. She was handcuffed, read her rights, and transported to jail. The news sent shockwaves through the community. The woman who had been seen as a victim, a grieving mother who had lost her children to a brutal intruder, was now being accused of being the killer herself. The narrative had completely flipped. The sympathy that had been extended to her evaporated for many people. If the police believed she had done this, if they had arrested her, then surely she must be guilty. But not everyone was convinced. Darlie maintained her innocence from the moment of her arrest. She insisted that an intruder had attacked them, that she had not hurt her children, that she was being falsely accused. Her family believed her. Her husband Darren stood by her, insisting that the police had made a terrible mistake. Friends and supporters rallied to her defense. The case became a media sensation. It had all the elements that capture public attention: a beautiful suburban family, murdered children, a mother accused of the unthinkable. Television news programs covered it extensively. Newspapers ran front-page stories. The details of the case were debated endlessly in living rooms and break rooms across America. Darlie was held without bail. The prosecution argued that she was a flight risk and a danger to her remaining child, Drake. The judge agreed. Darlie was transferred to the Lou Sterrett Justice Center in Dallas to await trial. She was placed in isolation for her own protection, as women accused of killing children are often targeted by other inmates. In jail, Darlie struggled to maintain her sanity. She was separated from Drake, from Darren, from everything familiar. She was grieving the loss of Devon and Damon, while also facing the nightmare of being accused of their murders. She wrote letters to family and friends maintaining her innocence, begging people to believe her. She prayed constantly, finding what comfort she could in faith. Darren visited as often as he was allowed. He brought photos of Drake, updates on the baby's growth and development. He told Darlie he believed in her, that he knew she hadn't done this, that they would prove her innocence. His support was crucial to her survival during those dark months in jail. The legal process began to unfold. Darlie needed a defense attorney, someone been experienced in capital murder cases. Her family didn't have the money to hire a top-tier defense team, so they scrambled to find lawyers willing to take the case, to raise funds, to build the team that Darlie would need to fight for her life. The prosecution, meanwhile, was building their case. The district attorney's office assigned the case to experienced prosecutors who had handled murder cases before. They had the evidence from the crime scene, the forensic reports, the witness statements. They were confident they could prove Darley's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. The theory of the prosecution was that Darley had killed her children in a moment of rage or desperation, likely motivated by financial stress and resentment over her life circumstances. They theorized that she had used the bread knife from her kitchen to stab Devin and Damon while they slept. She had then staged the crime scene, cutting the window screen, placing the sock in the alley, injuring herself to create the appearance of being attacked. She had called 911 and played the role of a victim and grieving mother. The defense's theory was that Darley was telling the truth. An intruder had entered the house through the garage, had attacked Darley and the boys, and had fled. Darley was a victim, not a perpetrator. The evidence could be interpreted in ways that supported her innocence. The investigation had been rushed and had focused on her unfairly, ignoring other possibilities. Both sides began preparing for trial. Witnesses were interviewed. Experts were consulted. Evidence was analyzed and reanalyzed. The case would be complex, technical, emotional. It would require the jury to make sense of blood spatter patterns, DNA evidence, forensic timelines, and psychological profiles. And ultimately, they would have to decide, was Darley Routier a grieving mother wrongly accused, or a cold-blooded killer who murdered her own children? The trial was scheduled for January 1997, 7 months after the murders. It would be held in Kerrville, Texas, far from Dallas, because of concerns about pretrial publicity making it impossible to find an impartial jury in the Dallas area. The change of venue meant additional hardship for Darley's family and supporters, who would have to travel hours to attend the trial. As the trial date approached, both sides worked frantically to prepare. The prosecution organized their evidence, prepared their witnesses, refined their arguments. They were seeking the death penalty, arguing that the murders were especially heinous and cruel, that Darley deserved the ultimate punishment if convicted. The defense team faced enormous challenges. They were working with limited resources against a prosecution with the full power of the state behind it. They needed to find experts who could counter the prosecution's forensic evidence, who could offer alternative interpretations of the blood spatter and DNA. They needed to create reasonable doubt in the minds of jurors, who would be confronted with horrific evidence and emotional testimony. The media coverage intensified as the trial approached. Television programs aired specials about the case. Newspapers published investigative pieces. Public opinion was sharply divided. Some people were convinced of Darley's guilt based on the evidence that had been made public. Others believed she was innocent, a victim of a rush to judgment by police who had failed to properly investigate other possibilities. The silly string video had been released to the media and was played repeatedly on news programs. For many people, that video was damning. They saw a woman who seemed to be enjoying herself at her son's grave just days after his murder. They saw someone who wasn't grieving appropriately, whose behavior seemed abnormal and suspicious. The video became emblematic of the case, a visual shorthand for why people believed Darley was guilty. Darley's supporters tried to contextualize the video. They explained that the silly string moment was a brief part of a much longer and more somber gravesite visit. They pointed out that people grieve differently, that celebrating a child's birthday, even after death, was a way some families coped with loss. They argued that judging someone's guilt based on their grieving behavior was unfair and unscientific, but the damage was done. The video had shaped public perception in ways that would be difficult to overcome. In December of 1996, just weeks before the trial was set to begin, the defense team received the complete forensic reports from the prosecution. As they reviewed the evidence, they realized the extent of what they were facing. The blood evidence was extensive and complex. The prosecution had expert witnesses who would testify that the blood patterns proved Darley's guilt. The defense needed their own experts, and they needed them quickly. The defense hired forensic consultants to review the evidence and prepare counter-arguments. These experts examined the photos, the reports, the physical evidence. Some of them raised questions about the prosecution's interpretation of the blood evidence. They suggested alternative explanations for the patterns and locations of blood. They questioned whether the forensic analysis had been as definitive as the prosecution claimed. But finding weaknesses in the prosecution's case and proving Darley's innocence were two different things. The defense needed to do more than create doubt about specific pieces of evidence. They needed to present a coherent alternative theory of what happened, one that explained all the evidence in a way that was consistent with Darley's innocence. The problem was that the evidence was difficult to explain if Darley was innocent. The lack of forced entry, the use of a knife from the house, the blood patterns that suggested Darley had been moving around in ways inconsistent with her story, the sock in the alley, the cut screen that appeared to be cut from the inside. Each piece of evidence on its own might have an innocent explanation, but all of them together created a picture that was hard to reconcile with the intruder theory. The defense strategy became focused on creating reasonable doubt. They would challenge the reliability of the forensic evidence. They would question the thoroughness of the police investigation. They would present Darley as a loving mother who had no motive to kill her children. They would argue that the prosecution's theory didn't make sense, that a mother who wanted to kill her children wouldn't do it in such a brutal and risky way, wouldn't stage such an elaborate crime scene. As 1996 drew to a close, Darley spent Christmas in jail, separated from Drake and Darren, missing her first Christmas without Devin and Damon. The holidays were unbearable. She thought about what the boys would have been doing, what presents they would have received, how excited they would have been. Instead, they were dead, and she was sitting in a jail cell accused of murdering them. Darren was struggling to hold everything together. He had baby Drake to care for, a business that was failing, mounting legal bills, and a wife in jail facing the death penalty. His parents helped with Drake, but the weight on Darren was crushing. He visited Darley as often as possible, tried to stay strong for her, but privately he was falling apart. The first week of January 1997 arrived. The trial would begin in just days. Both sides made their final preparations. Witnesses were prepped. Opening statements were drafted and revised. Evidence exhibits were organized. The stage was set for a trial that would captivate the nation and determine whether Darley Routier would spend their life in prison or be put to death for the murders of her two young sons. The prosecution was confident. They believed the evidence was overwhelming, that the jury would see clearly what had happened. They had forensic experts, crime scene photos, the 911 call, the silly string video. They had a compelling narrative of a mother who had snapped under the pressure of her life and killed her children in a moment of rage. The defense was more uncertain but determined. They believed Darley was innocent, that she had been railroaded by a police investigation that had focused on her too quickly and too completely. They believed the evidence could be interpreted differently, that reasonable doubt existed, that a jury would see that the prosecution hadn't proven its case beyond that crucial threshold. The jury would ultimately decide. 12 people who had never met Darley Routier, who knew nothing about the case beyond what they heard in court, would determine her fate. They would listen to weeks of testimony. They would examine hundreds of pieces of evidence. They would deliberate and debate and ultimately vote on whether the state of Texas had proven that Darley Routier murdered Devin and Damon Routier. And if they found her guilty, a second phase of the trial would begin. The same jury would then decide whether Darley should be sentenced to life in prison or put to death by lethal injection. The stakes could not be higher. January 6, 1997. The trial of Darley Routier began in Kerrville, Texas, a small city in the hill country about 400 miles from Dallas. The Kerr County Courthouse became the center of intense media attention as news trucks lined the streets and reporters jockeyed for position. Inside, the courtroom filled with spectators, family members, journalists, and curious onlookers who had followed the case and wanted to see justice unfold. Jury selection had taken place in the days leading up to the trial. Finding impartial jurors in a case that had received such extensive media coverage was challenging. Potential jurors were questioned extensively about their knowledge of the case, their exposure to patrial publicity, their ability to remain unbiased. Eventually, 12 jurors and alternates were selected. They represented a cross-section of Kerr County, people with different backgrounds and perspectives who would now be tasked with one of the most difficult decisions any citizen can face. Judge Mark Tall presided over the trial. He was experienced, no nonsense, committed to ensuring that the trial was conducted fairly and according to law. He made it clear from the beginning that he would not tolerate disruptions, that decorum would be maintained, that this trial would proceed with the seriousness and dignity it deserved. The prosecution team was led by Greg Davis, an experienced prosecutor from the Dallas County District Attorney's Office. He was joined by assistant prosecutors who had worked on preparing the case for months. Davis was methodical, detail-oriented, known for his ability to present complex evidence clearly. He had prosecuted murder cases before and understood how to build a case that would convince a jury. The defense team consisted of several attorneys working together to represent Darlie. They faced the enormous challenge of defending a client accused of one of the most horrific crimes imaginable, against a prosecution with extensive resources and compelling evidence. They knew they were fighting an uphill battle, but they believed in Darlie's innocence and were determined to give her the best defense possible. Darlie sat at the defense table wearing conservative clothing chosen to make her appear sympathetic and relatable to the jury. Her long dark hair was styled neatly. She wore minimal makeup, a stark contrast to the glamorous appearance she had favored before the murders. Her family sat in the gallery behind her, a show of support and solidarity. Darren was there every day, often holding baby Drake, a visual reminder that Darlie was a mother to a living child, not just the accused killer of two others. The prosecution's opening statement laid out their theory of the case in stark, unflinching terms. Greg Davis stood before the jury and told them that they would hear evidence proving beyond any reasonable doubt that Darlie her own chilling scene. He described the crime scene, the brutality of the stabbings, the suffering of Devon and Damon. He told the jury that the evidence would show this was not a random intruder attack, but a staged crime scene created by Darlie to cover up her own actions. Davis explained that the jury would hear from forensic experts who analyzed the blood evidence and determined that it was inconsistent with Darlie's story. They would see crime scene photos that showed the lack of forced entry, the knife from the Rodier's own kitchen used as the murder weapon, evidence that the window screen had been cut from inside the house. They would hear the 911 call and form their own judgments about whether Darlie sounded like a genuine victim or someone playing a role. The prosecutor told the jury about the sock found in the alley, suggesting it had been placed there by Darlie to create false evidence of an intruder fleeing the scene. He mentioned the financial problems the Routiers faced, the life insurance policies on the children, Darlie's statements to friends about feeling overwhelmed by motherhood. He painted a picture of a woman who had reached a breaking point and committed an unspeakable act. Finally, Davis told the jury they would see the silly string video. He acknowledged that it might seem odd to judge someone based on how they grieved, but he argued that the video showed something important about Darlie's character and state of mind. A mother who could laugh and spray silly string on her murdered child's grave days after his death was not displaying normal grief, and the jury should consider what that behavior revealed. The defense's opening statement took a completely different approach. The defense attorney stood before the jury and told them that they were about to witness a tragedy compounded by injustice. Darlie Routier was not a murderer but a victim, a mother who had lost her children to a violent intruder and was now being falsely accused of killing them herself. The defense acknowledged that the crime scene was horrific, that the evidence was complex, but argued that the police had rushed to judgment. Instead of conducting a thorough investigation that considered all possibilities, they had focused on Darlie almost immediately and had interpreted every piece of evidence through the lens of her guilt. Evidence that could be explained in multiple ways had been presented, as if it could only mean one thing. The defense told the jury that forensic evidence was not always as clear-cut as the prosecution would claim. Blood spatter analysis was an interpretive science, not an exact one. Different experts could look at the same evidence and reach different conclusions. The defense would present their own experts who would offer alternative interpretations that were consistent with Darley's innocence. The defense attorney spoke about Darley as a person, a young mother who loved her children, who had taken care of them and celebrated their lives. The idea that she could brutally stab them to death made no sense. What mother would kill her children in such a violent way? What mother would risk being caught in such an obvious lie? If Darley had wanted to harm her children, surely there would have been easier, less risky methods. The defense addressed the silly string video directly. They acknowledged it looked bad, that it seemed inappropriate to some people. But they asked the jury to remember that grief manifests differently in different people. Some cultures and families celebrate the lives of the deceased rather than focusing only on mourning. The silly string moment was a brief part of a longer, more somber visit to the gravesite. Judging Darley's entire character and assuming her guilt, based on a few minutes of video, was unfair and wrong. The defense concluded by reminding the jury of the burden of proof. The prosecution had to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. If the jury had any reasonable doubt about whether Darley committed these murders, they were required to find her not guilty. The defense would show that reasonable doubt existed, that the evidence did not conclusively prove Darley's guilt, and that she deserved to be acquitted and reunited with her surviving son. With opening statements complete, the presentation of evidence began. The prosecution called their first witnesses, starting with the first responders who had arrived at the scene on June 6. Officer David Waddell took the stand and described what he had encountered when he entered the Rodier home at 2:37 a.m. Waddell's testimony was matter of fact but powerful. He described the blood, the two boys lying on the floor, Darley standing in the kitchen with a towel pressed to her neck. He recounted his conversation with Darley, how she had told him an intruder attacked them. He described searching the house for the intruder, finding no one, seeing no signs of forced entry. His testimony established the basic facts of the crime scene and the initial investigation. The defense cross-examined Waddell, trying to emphasize aspects of his testimony that supported Darley's innocence. Had he thoroughly searched for an intruder? Had he examined every possible exit route? Was it possible someone had escaped before he arrived? Waddell acknowledged that an intruder could have fled before police arrived, but maintained that he had found no evidence of anyone else in the house. The paramedics who had treated Darley and the boys testified next. They described the boys' injuries, their attempts to save Devon and Damon, the devastating realization that Devon was already dead and Damon's injuries were too severe to survive. They described treating Darley's neck wound, noting that while it looked dramatic and had bled heavily, it had not severed any major vessels and was not immediately life-threatening. The prosecution used the paramedics' testimony to establish the severity of the boys' injuries compared to Darley's. Devon and Damon had been stabbed multiple times with deep, forceful wounds that caused massive internal damage. Darley's wounds were superficial in comparison. The implication was clear if an intruder had attacked all three. Why were the children's injuries so much more severe than the mother's? The defense cross-examination focused on the chaos of the scene, and the paramedics' focus on saving lives rather than investigating a crime. The paramedics acknowledged they had been focused on medical treatment, not on preserving evidence or analyzing the scene. They couldn't speak to how the injuries occurred, only to what they observed when they arrived. Detective Jimmy Patterson took the stand and walked the jury through the investigation. He described the crime scene in detail, pointing to photographs that showed the family room, the kitchen, the utility room, the garage. He explained the police department's efforts to find evidence of an intruder, their canvassing of the neighborhood, their search for the murder weapon's origin, and any items an intruder might have discarded. Patterson described interviewing Darley at the hospital, her account of being attacked by an intruder she couldn't describe clearly. He explained how, as the investigation progressed, the evidence increasingly pointed toward Darley rather than an unknown intruder. He detailed the lack of forced entry, the knife from the kitchen being used, the cut screen that appeared staged. the sock in the alley that seemed placed rather than dropped. The prosecution walked Patterson through each piece of evidence methodically. They showed the jury photos of the window screen with the cut in it. Patterson explained that experts had determined the screen was cut from the inside, not the outside. They showed photos of the windowsill with its undisturbed dust and debris, indicating no one had climbed through. They showed the knife block in the kitchen with the empty slot where the murder weapon had been stored. Patterson testified about finding the sock in the alley approximately 75 yards from the house. He explained that the sock contained both Darley's blood and Damon's blood. He described the theory that someone from inside the house had placed it there to create false evidence of an intruder fleeing. When asked why an intruder would take a sock, Patterson said that question had troubled the investigation from the beginning and had led them to consider alternative explanations. The defense cross-examined Patterson aggressively, challenging his investigation and his conclusions. They asked whether he had pursued other leads, whether he had investigated the possibility of an intruder thoroughly before focusing on Darley. Patterson defended his investigation, saying they had followed every lead, and the evidence simply didn't support the intruder theory. The defense pointed out that the police had never found the supposed weapon an intruder would have brought, never found any physical evidence of an intruder's presence, never identified any suspects. Patterson acknowledged this but maintained that the absence of evidence of an intruder, combined with the evidence pointing to Darley, made the conclusion clear. The questioning became heated at times. The defense accused Patterson of tunnel vision, of deciding early on that Darley was guilty and then interpreting all evidence through that lens. Patterson denied this, insisting the evidence had led him to his conclusions, not preconceived notions. The exchange highlighted the fundamental disagreement at the heart of the case, whether the evidence clearly proved Darley's guilt, or whether it could be interpreted in ways consistent with her innocence. The medical examiner who had performed the autopsies on Devon and Damon testified next. This testimony was among the most difficult and emotional of the trial. The medical examiner described the boys' injuries in clinical detail, using anatomical terms and measurements. But the jury could see the autopsy photos, could see what had been done to these children, and the clinical language couldn't diminish the horror. Devon had been stabbed 4 times. The wounds were deep, penetrating his chest cavity, his lung, his back. The medical examiner described the path each knife wound took through Devon's small body, the damage it caused, the bleeding it produced. He explained that Devon would have lost consciousness quickly from blood loss and trauma, that death would have followed within minutes. Damon's injuries were described in similar detail: multiple stab wounds to his back and chest, a wound that penetrated his liver, another that collapsed his lung. The medical examiner noted that Damon had survived longer than Devon, that his body had fought to stay alive, but ultimately the injuries were too severe. He had died at the hospital approximately 4 hours after the attack. Both boys had defensive wounds on their hands and arms. The medical examiner explained that these wounds indicated the boys had been conscious during at least part of the attack, that they had tried to protect themselves, tried to ward off the knife. This testimony was devastating. The image of these children awake and fighting for their lives against someone stabbing them was almost unbearable. The prosecution asked the medical examiner about the force required to inflict such wounds. He explained that significant force was necessary to drive a knife through skin, muscle, and bone deep into the chest cavity. These were not tentative or accidental wounds. They were powerful, deliberate stabs intended to cause serious harm. The defense cross-examined the medical examiner, but there was little they could challenge in his testimony. The injuries were what they were. The defense tried to establish that the medical examiner couldn't determine from the wounds alone who had inflicted them, which was true but didn't help Darley's case much. The autopsy results were simply devastating evidence of brutal violence against 2 innocent children. The forensic blood spatter expert was perhaps the prosecution's most crucial witness. Blood spatter analysis would become the centerpiece of the prosecution's case, the evidence they believed definitively proved Darley's guilt. The expert, a specialist with years of experience analyzing blood patterns at crime scenes, took the stand and began explaining his findings. Blood spatter analysis is based on the principle that blood behaves in predictable ways based on physics and fluid dynamics. When blood drips, it creates certain patterns. When it's flung from a weapon, it creates different patterns. When it transfers from one surface to another through contact, it looks different still. By analyzing the size, shape, distribution, and location of blood drops and stains, experts can reconstruct aspects of a violent event. The expert walked the jury through the blood evidence found at the Rodier crime scene. He showed photos of blood drops on the floor, blood smears on surfaces, blood spatter on walls and furniture. He explained what each pattern indicated about movement and actions. He pointed out areas where the blood evidence contradicted Darley's account of events. Particularly important was the blood evidence in the kitchen. The expert described drops of Darley's blood in the sink and on the counter near the sink. The pattern of these drops indicated that Darley had been standing at the sink, stationary, bleeding from her neck wound while blood dripped down. But in Darley's account of events, she had been attacked, realized the boys were hurt, and immediately called 911. She had never mentioned standing at the sink. So when had she been there and why? The expert offered his interpretation. Darley had injured herself at the kitchen sink after the boys were attacked. She had cut her own neck, standing at the sink while blood dripped down, then moved to the phone to call 911. The blood pattern supported this sequence of events, he argued, and contradicted Darley's claim of being attacked by an intruder. The expert also testified about cast-off blood spatter found on Darley's nightshirt. Cast-off spatter occurs when blood is flung from a bloody object like a knife as it's raised between strikes. The expert showed the jury photos of Darley's nightshirt with tiny spots of blood on the back, on the shoulders, in patterns consistent with cast-off from a knife being wielded in stabbing motions. The prosecution argued that this cast-off spatter proved Darley had been holding the knife when the boys were stabbed. The spatter pattern showed that she had been in close proximity to the stabbing, in a position consistent with wielding the knife herself. An intruder attacking the boys wouldn't have created cast-off spatter on Darley's nightshirt in those locations and patterns. The expert's testimony was technical and detailed. He used diagrams and demonstrations to help the jury understand blood spatter mechanics. He walked through each piece of blood evidence systematically, building a comprehensive picture of what the blood patterns revealed about the crime. His conclusion was clear. The blood evidence was inconsistent with an intruder attack, and consistent with Darley having stabbed the boys herself. The defense cross-examination of the blood spatter expert was extensive and aggressive. The defense brought in their own blood spatter expert who had reviewed the evidence and reached different conclusions. Blood spatter analysis, the defense expert explained, was not an exact science. Different experts could interpret the same patterns differently. Variables like surface texture, blood viscosity, and environmental factors could all affect how blood behaved and what patterns it created. The defense expert questioned whether the cast-off spatter on Darley's nightshirt definitively proved she wielded the knife. He suggested alternative explanations. If Darley had been close to the boys when they were attacked, if she had tried to help them or pull the attacker off them, she could have gotten cast-off spatter on her clothing without wielding the knife herself. The prosecution's interpretation wasn't the only possible explanation. Regarding the blood in the kitchen sink, the defense expert suggested that Darley might have gone to the sink during the chaos after the attack, perhaps to wet a towel or get water, and that's when blood dripped from her neck wound. The sequence of events was confusing and traumatic, so Darley might not remember clearly every movement she made. The blood in the sink didn't necessarily prove she injured herself there deliberately. The battle of the experts highlighted a crucial aspect of the trial. Much of the prosecution's case relied on forensic evidence that required interpretation. The jury was being asked to accept the prosecution's experts' interpretations as definitive proof of guilt. But the defense was showing that other experts, looking at the same evidence, could reach different conclusions. Which experts should the jury believe? The prosecution called witnesses who testified about Darley's behavior and statements in the days and weeks after the murders. These witnesses painted a picture of a woman whose grief seemed performative rather than genuine, whose behavior seemed calculated rather than spontaneous. One witness described visiting Darley in the hospital after the murders and being struck by how Darley seemed more concerned with appearance than with her dead children. Darley had asked for a mirror, had worried about how she looked, had seemed focused on superficial matters when her sons had just been killed. Another witness testified about conversations with Darley in which she had complained about the demands of motherhood, about feeling overwhelmed and wanting her old life back. The prosecution used these statements to suggest motive, to show that Darley resented her children and might have wanted to be free of them. Friends who had known Darley for years testified about her personality. Some described her as materialistic, focused on appearances, someone who cared deeply about projecting an image of success and beauty. The prosecution argued that this personality type could lead someone to commit murder if they felt their carefully constructed life was falling apart due to financial problems and the stress of raising children. The defense countered with their own character witnesses who described Darley very differently. These witnesses talked about Darley as a loving mother who doted on her children, who threw elaborate birthday parties, who took hundreds of photos documenting their lives. They described her as generous and fun-loving, someone who would never harm her children. The defense emphasized that millions of mothers feel overwhelmed sometimes, that complaining about the difficulties of parenting doesn't make someone a murderer. They argued that the prosecution was taking normal human feelings and twisting them into sinister motives, that the character evidence against Darley was based on selective and distorted interpretations of her personality. The silly string video was played for the jury. The courtroom fell silent as the footage rolled. There was Darley at the gravesite on what would have been Devon's 7th birthday. Family members were gathered around. Someone handed Darley a can of silly string. She sprayed it on the grave, smiling, laughing. Other family members did the same. It looked celebratory, festive even. For several minutes, the video showed what appeared to be a party at a child's grave. The prosecution let the video speak for itself. They didn't editorialize much, didn't need to. The jury's faces showed their reactions. Some looked shocked, others disgusted. The video was powerful evidence of something, though what exactly it proved was to interpretation. The defense tried to minimize the damage. They explained that the video showed only a few minutes of a much longer visit to the cemetery. Before and after the silly string moment, Darley had been crying, grieving, devastated. The silly string was a brief attempt to celebrate Devon's birthday, in the only way they could now. A cultural and familial approach to honoring the dead that might seem strange to some people, but was not evidence of guilt. The defense called a grief counselor as an expert witness to testify about the many different ways people grieve. The counselor explained that there is no correct way to grieve, that different cultures and families have different traditions, that sometimes people laugh and celebrate even in the midst of profound loss, as a way of coping with unbearable pain. But the damage was done. The jury had seen the video. They had seen Darley smiling and laughing at her murdered child's grave just 8 days after his death. Whether that proved guilt or was simply unusual grief behavior, each juror would have to decide for themselves. The prosecution presented the Routiers' financial problems: bank statements, credit card bills, loan documents. They showed that the family was significantly in debt, that Darren's business was struggling, that they were behind on payments. They introduced evidence of life insurance policies on the children, totaling about $10,000 for both boys. The prosecution suggested that financial desperation could be a motive for murder. If Darley felt trapped by her life, overwhelmed by debt and the responsibilities of motherhood, she might have seen killing as a way out. The insurance money wasn't significant, but it was something. And more importantly, without the children, Darley and Darren would have fewer expenses and more freedom to rebuild their lives. The defense fought hard against this theory. They brought financial experts who testified that while the Routiers had debt, they were not in desperate circumstances. Many Americans carry credit card debt. The mortgage was being paid. They were managing. And the life insurance policies were small, barely enough to cover funeral expenses. The idea that someone would murder their children for $5,000 each was absurd. The defense also pointed out that if financial gain was the motive, why kill only 2 of the 3 children? Drake had survived, sleeping upstairs in his crib. If Darlie was killing her children to collect insurance and reduce expenses, why not kill all 3? The selective nature of the murders didn't support the financial motive theory. Darren Routier took the stand as a defense witness. His testimony was crucial. He was Darlie's husband, the father of the murdered children, the only other adult in the house that night. His support for Darlie and his account of events could significantly impact the jury's perception of the case. Darren testified about his marriage to Darlie, describing a loving relationship despite normal ups and downs. He talked about Devon and Damon, his voice breaking with emotion as he described his sons. He told the jury about the night of June 5th, working late on the computer, going to bed around midnight, waking to Darlie's screams around 2:30 a.m. He described running downstairs and finding the horrific scene. He recounted performing CPR on Devon, desperately trying to save his son, knowing it was probably futile but unable to give up. He talked about the ambulance ride to the hospital, the moment when doctors told him Damon had died too. He sobbed on the stand, overwhelmed by the memory. Most importantly, Darren testified that he absolutely believed Darlie was innocent. He said he knew his wife, knew her heart, knew she could never harm their children. He said the police had made a terrible mistake, had focused on the wrong person, had failed to find the real killer. His belief in Darlie was unshakable. The prosecution cross-examined Darren carefully. They asked about his finances, about arguments he and Darlie had about money. They asked about Darlie's state of mind in the weeks before the murders, whether she had seemed depressed or angry. They asked whether Darren was aware of how bad the financial situation really was. Darren admitted there had been stress about money but insisted it wasn't overwhelming. He said Darlie had seemed tired and overwhelmed by the children sometimes, but what mother of 3 young children didn't feel that way? He became defensive when the prosecution suggested he was either lying to protect Darlie or was in denial about her guilt. The prosecution asked Darren whether, if the evidence proved Darlie was guilty, he would accept that truth. Darren said the evidence didn't prove that the evidence was being misinterpreted, that Darlie was innocent regardless of what experts said about blood spatter. His loyalty to his wife was absolute, but the prosecution suggested to the jury that loyalty could blind someone to uncomfortable truths. The defense rested their case after several days of testimony. They had presented their own experts, their character witnesses, their alternative interpretations of the evidence. They had tried to create reasonable doubt, to show that the prosecution's case, while compelling, was not conclusive. Whether they had succeeded would soon be known. Closing arguments began. The prosecution went first, summarizing their case against Darlie. Greg Davis stood before the jury and reviewed the evidence piece by piece. The lack of forced entry, the knife from the kitchen, the staged window screen, the sock in the alley, the blood evidence that contradicted Darlie's story, the cast-off spatter on her nightshirt, the superficial nature of her own wounds, the silly string video showing inappropriate behavior, the financial problems creating potential motive. Davis argued that each piece of evidence on its own might be explained away, but together they created an overwhelming picture of guilt. Darlie had killed her children, staged a crime scene, injured herself to appear as a victim, and then lied about it all. The evidence proved this beyond any reasonable doubt. The prosecutor addressed the elephant in the room: why would a mother do this? Davis acknowledged that it seemed unthinkable, that it violated every instinct and expectation about maternal love. But he argued that the evidence proved it happened regardless of whether it made emotional sense. Some people, under the right combination of stress and personality and circumstance, were capable of terrible things. The jury's job was to follow the evidence, not to decide what they wished had happened. Davis concluded by asking the jury to find Darlie guilty, to hold her accountable for the brutal murders of Devon and Damon Routier, to ensure that justice was served for two innocent children who had their lives stolen from them by the person who should have protected them most. The defense's closing argument focused on reasonable doubt. The defense attorney reminded the jury that the burden of proof was on the prosecution, that they had to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, and that if the jury had any reasonable doubt they were required to acquit. The defense attorney walked the jury through each piece of evidence the prosecution had presented and offered alternative explanations. The lack of forced entry could mean the intruder entered through an unlocked door, which Darlie may have forgotten to lock. The knife from the kitchen could have been grabbed by an intruder who found it readily available. The cut screen might have been cut from the outside in a way that appeared to experts like it was cut from the inside. Or it could have been cut earlier for unrelated reasons. The sock in the alley could have been dropped by a fleeing intruder. The blood evidence was subject to interpretation, and the defense's experts had shown that the prosecution's interpretation wasn't the only possible one. Darlie's wounds were real and required medical treatment. The fact that they weren't fatal didn't mean they were self-inflicted. The silly string video showed unusual but not criminal behavior. Financial problems didn't create a motive for murder, especially when the insurance payouts were so small. The defense attorney emphasized that the prosecution had not presented a single piece of direct evidence proving Darlie committed these murders. No one saw her do it. She had no history of violence. She had no history of abusing her children. The prosecution's case was built entirely on circumstantial evidence and expert interpretations that were disputed by other experts. The attorney asked the jury to consider the bigger picture. If Darlie had wanted to kill her children, would she have done it in such a risky way? Would she have stabbed them in the same room where she was sleeping, where she would inevitably be covered in their blood? Would she have called 911 immediately and allowed police to examine the scene while evidence was still fresh? Would she have injured herself in a way that required hospital treatment and left her with permanent scars? If this was a planned murder, the defense argued, it was executed in the stupidest possible way. If it was an impulsive act, where was the evidence of the emotional breakdown that would have preceded it? Darlie hadn't been found in a state of psychotic rage. She had been coherent enough to call 911, to speak to operators and police, to go to the hospital. The prosecution's theory didn't make psychological sense. The defense attorney concluded with an emotional appeal. He spoke directly about Devon and Damon, about the tragedy of their deaths, about how their mother loved them and missed them, and would carry the pain of their loss for the rest of her life. He said that convicting Darlie wouldn't bring the boys back, wouldn't provide justice if she was innocent, would only compound the tragedy by destroying what remained of the family. He asked the jury to carefully consider all the evidence, to not let their emotions override their judgment, and to acquit Darlie if they had any reasonable doubt about her guilt. The prosecution had the opportunity for rebuttal. Greg Davis rose and addressed the jury one final time. He acknowledged the defense's arguments but dismissed them as desperate attempts to explain away overwhelming evidence. He said that reasonable doubt didn't mean any doubt, didn't mean imagining far-fetched scenarios to avoid an unpleasant conclusion. Reasonable doubt meant doubt based on reason, based on the evidence, and the evidence in this case pointed clearly in one direction. Davis reminded the jury of the blood spatter on Darlie's nightshirt, the blood in the kitchen sink, the lack of any physical evidence of an intruder. He reminded them of the silly string video, of Darlie's behavior that showed someone more concerned with appearances than with genuine grief. He asked them to use their common sense, to see what was clearly in front of them, and to have the courage to convict even though the crime was horrific and the defendant was the children's mother. With closing arguments complete, Judge Tall gave the jury their instructions. He explained the law they were to apply, the definition of reasonable doubt, the elements of the crime that had to be proven. He told them their duty was to consider only the evidence presented in court, to set aside any outside information or personal biases, and to reach a verdict based solely on whether the prosecution had proven its case beyond a reasonable doubt. The jury retired to deliberate. They would spend hours, possibly days, reviewing evidence, discussing testimony, debating the interpretations offered by both sides. 12 people who had been strangers weeks ago would now have to reach a unanimous decision about whether Darlie Routier was guilty of capital murder. The wait was excruciating for everyone involved. Darlie sat in a holding cell near the courtroom, unable to do anything but pray and hope. Her family gathered in the courthouse trying to stay calm, trying to maintain faith that the jury would see the truth. Darren held Drake, the toddler, oblivious to the proceedings that would determine whether his mother would be free or imprisoned or sentenced to death. The prosecution team felt confident but knew that juries could be unpredictable. They had presented what they believed was an overwhelming case, but they had seen seemingly strong cases result in acquittals before. They could only wait and see what the jury decided. The hours ticked by slowly. The first day of deliberations ended without a verdict. The jury was sequestered, taken to a hotel for the night, kept away from media coverage and outside influences. They would resume deliberations in the morning. The waiting continued. On the second day of deliberations, word came that the jury had reached a verdict. The courtroom filled quickly. Family members rushed back. Media representatives jockeyed for position. The tension was unbearable. Darlie was brought back to the defense table, her face pale, her hands shaking. She gripped her attorney's hand as the jury filed back into the courtroom. Judge Tall asked if the jury had reached a unanimous verdict. The foreperson said they had. The verdict form was handed to the judge, who reviewed it silently before handing it to the court clerk to be read aloud. The clerk stood and read. Would the jury find the defendant, Darlie Lynn Routier, guilty of capital murder in the death of Damon Christian Routier? The courtroom erupted. Darlie's family members cried out in anguish and disbelief. Darlie herself collapsed, sobbing, shaking her head. Darren sat stunned, unable to process what he had just heard. The prosecution team allowed themselves small smiles of satisfaction. They had won their case. Judge Toll gabbled for order, restoring quiet to the courtroom. The conviction was for the murder of Damon only. The prosecution had strategically chosen to try Darlie for only one murder, keeping the other in reserve in case they needed to retrieve her. But the conviction for Damon's murder carried the same potential penalties as if she had been convicted of both. Now the trial would enter its second phase, the penalty phase. The same jury that had found Darlie guilty would now hear additional evidence and testimony to help them decide whether she should be sentenced to life in prison or death by lethal injection. This phase would focus less on the facts of the crime, which had been established by the conviction, and more on Darlie's character, her potential for future dangerousness, and whether mitigating factors existed that would argue against a death sentence. The penalty phase began after a brief recess. The prosecution's goal was to convince the jury that Darlie deserved the ultimate punishment. They would argue that the murder was especially heinous and cruel, that it involved a child victim, and that Darlie posed a continuing threat to society. The prosecution presented evidence of the brutal nature of Damon's death. They showed the autopsy photos again, reminded the jury of the multiple stab wounds, the defensive injuries showing Damon had fought for his life. They emphasized that Damon had been 5 years old, completely innocent and vulnerable, killed by his own mother in his own home where he should have been safe. They argued that the murder showed a level of depravity that warranted the death penalty. This wasn't a crime of passion in the heat of sudden rage. The attack involved multiple stab wounds, continued assault even after the victim was down and dying. It showed deliberation and persistence in violence. It showed a cold-blooded willingness to kill a child. The prosecution also argued that Darlie would be dangerous even in prison. If she was willing to kill her own children, who would she not be willing to harm? She had shown herself capable of extreme violence and deception. She had never expressed remorse, had never admitted guilt, had never shown any sign of accepting responsibility for what she had done. Without rehabilitation or remorse, she remained a danger. The defense fought desperately to save Darlie's life. They presented mitigating evidence, testimony from family and friends about Darlie's positive qualities, her love for her children, the good things she had done in her life. They called witnesses who described Darlie as kind and generous, as someone who had helped others and been a good friend. They argued that Darlie had no prior criminal history, no history of violence before this incident. If she had committed this crime, and the defense still maintained she hadn't, it was an aberration, a single terrible moment that didn't define her entire character or predict future behavior. The defense presented psychological experts who testified about Darlie's mental state. They suggested that if she had killed the children, it might have been the result of postpartum depression, undiagnosed mental illness, or a psychological break caused by overwhelming stress. These were not excuses, the defense argued, but explanations that showed Darlie was not inherently evil or irredeemable. Darlie herself considered testifying during the penalty phase. The decision was agonizing. Testifying would give her a chance to speak directly to the jury, to maintain her innocence, to plead for her life, but it would also open her up to cross-examination by the prosecution, who would attack her credibility and her account of events. Ultimately, Darlie did take the stand during the penalty phase. She sat in the witness box, her voice shaking, and told the jury that she had not killed her children. She said she loved Devon and Damon more than anything in the world, that she missed them every second of every day, that the pain of their loss was unbearable. She said she understood the jury had found her guilty, but they were wrong. She was innocent. She pleaded with the jury to spare her life. She talked about Drake, her surviving son, who needed his mother. She said that being in prison for a crime she didn't commit would be punishment enough, that she didn't deserve to die for something she hadn't done. She cried as she spoke, her grief and fear evident to everyone in the courtroom. The prosecution cross-examined her harshly. Greg Davis challenged her account of events, pointed out inconsistencies in her statements, asked her to explain the blood evidence and the other physical evidence that contradicted her story. Darlie maintained her innocence but struggled to explain evidence that the experts said proved her guilt. Davis asked Darlie about the silly string video. How could she explain laughing at her son's grave just days after his murder? Darlie said it was a celebration of Devon's life, a cultural and family tradition, that the video didn't show the hours of crying before and after. Davis suggested it showed someone who wasn't really grieving, someone who was performing rather than feeling genuine emotion. The exchange was brutal. Darlie left the witness stand emotionally devastated, uncertain whether her testimony had helped or hurt her case. The jury's faces were unreadable. They had heard her plea, but whether it would move them to spare her life remained to be seen. The penalty phase closing arguments were emotionally charged. The prosecution argued that the nature of the crime demanded the death penalty. Killing a 5-year-old child in such a brutal way was among the most heinous crimes imaginable. If this crime didn't warrant the death penalty, what crime did? The defense pleaded for mercy. They argued that killing Darlie wouldn't bring Devon and Damon back, wouldn't undo the tragedy. They said that life in prison was severe punishment, that Darlie would suffer every day for the rest of her life even if she was spared execution. They asked the jury to choose life over death. The jury deliberated on the sentence for several hours. When they returned, they announced their decision: death by lethal injection. Darlie Routier was sentenced to die for the murder of her son Damon. The courtroom reaction was mixed. Some people felt justice had been served, that Darlie had received the punishment she deserved for committing such an evil act. Others felt the sentence was too harsh, that executing Darlie would not accomplish anything meaningful, that doubt about her guilt should have led to a life sentence instead. Darlie was devastated. She had maintained her innocence throughout the trial, had truly believed the jury would see that she hadn't killed her children. The guilty verdict had been shocking. The death sentence was almost incomprehensible. She was going to die for a crime she insisted she didn't commit. Judge Toll formally sentenced Darlie to die on February 4, 1997. She was transported to the Mountain View unit in Gatesville, Texas, the state's death row for women. She would live in a small cell isolated from other inmates, waiting for her appeals to run out and her execution date to be set. The appeals process began immediately. Darlie's defense team filed notices of appeal, challenging various aspects of the trial and conviction. They argued that errors had been made, that evidence had been improperly admitted or excluded, that the jury instructions were flawed, that the prosecution had engaged in misconduct. The appeals would take years, winding through state and federal courts. Darren remained committed to proving Darley's innocence. He became active in the effort to get her conviction overturned, working with attorneys, investigators, and advocates. He maintained publicly that Darley was innocent, that the real killer had never been found, that the justice system had failed his family catastrophically. The case attracted significant media attention even after the trial ended. Television programs produced documentaries examining the evidence and the verdict. Some programs supported the guilty verdict, presenting the evidence as overwhelming proof of Darley's guilt. Others questioned the verdict, highlighting problems with the investigation and trial that suggested reasonable doubt should have led to acquittal. One of the most significant issues raised on appeal was the question of whether Darley had received adequate legal representation. The defense team had been working with limited resources against a well-funded prosecution. Questions were raised about whether the defense had conducted sufficient investigation, whether they had consulted with enough experts, whether they had presented the strongest possible case. The appeals also challenged the blood spatter evidence. Darley's appellate attorneys brought in new experts who reviewed the evidence and reached conclusions different from those presented at trial. These experts argued that the prosecution's blood spatter analysis was flawed, that the interpretations were not supported by the science, that the evidence did not definitively prove Darley wielded the knife. There were also questions about evidence that hadn't been presented to the jury. The defense claimed that the prosecution had withheld potentially exculpatory evidence, information that might have supported Darley's innocence or created reasonable doubt. They argued that this violation of discovery rules warranted a new trial. One piece of evidence that became controversial after the trial was a bloody fingerprint found at the scene. The print was not Darley's, not Darren's, and not identified as belonging to any known person. The defense argued that this unidentified print supported the intruder theory, that someone else had been in the house during the attack. The prosecution argued that the print could have come from first responders, or could have been left another time unrelated to the murders. As the appeals progressed through the courts, new forensic technologies became available. DNA testing had advanced significantly since 1996. Darley's supporters pushed for new DNA testing of evidence from the crime scene, hoping that modern techniques might reveal evidence of an intruder that had been missed by earlier testing. Some items were retested. The sock found in the alley was subjected to more sophisticated DNA analysis. The results confirmed what had been found earlier. The sock contained Darley's blood and Damon's blood. No DNA from an unknown intruder was found. This was disappointing for those hoping DNA evidence would prove Darley's innocence. Other items from the crime scene were tested as well with mixed results. Some testing revealed nothing new. Some testing was inconclusive. None of the testing definitively proved Darley's innocence or identified an intruder. The appeals based on new DNA evidence were not successful. The legal battles continued year after year. Appeals were filed in state court, rejected, appealed to higher courts. Habeas corpus petitions were filed in federal court. Each step of the process took months or years. Darley remained on death row, aging, watching other inmates be executed while her own appeals continued. Life on death row was grueling. Darley spent 23 hours a day in her cell, with only 1 hour allowed for recreation or showering. She had limited contact with other inmates. Visits from family were restricted and ducted through glass barriers with phone communication. She couldn't touch her surviving son Drake, couldn't hold him or comfort him, could only see him through a window. Drake grew up without his mother. Darren did his best to raise the boy, to give him a normal life despite the extraordinary circumstances. Drake knew his brothers had died when he was a baby. He knew his mother was in prison. As he got older, he was told that his mother had been convicted of killing Devon and Damon, but that she and many others believed she was innocent. The psychological impact on Drake of having his brothers murdered and his mother on death row was profound. He received counseling and therapy to help him process the trauma and loss. The question of his mother's guilt or innocence hung over his entire childhood. Did his mother kill his brothers? The courts said yes. His father and his mother said no. For a child trying to make sense of his family history, the uncertainty was agonizing. Darlie's family never wavered in their support. Her mother, Darlie Key, became one of the most vocal advocates for her daughter's innocence. She appeared on television programs, gave interviews, letter-writing campaigns. She insisted that Darlie was innocent, that the evidence had been misinterpreted, that the jury had gotten it wrong. The case developed a following among people interested in true crime and potential wrongful convictions. Websites and forums dedicated to the case attracted thousands of participants who debated the evidence and the verdict. Some were convinced of Darlie's guilt and felt the justice system had worked correctly. Others believed she was innocent and had been railroaded by a flawed investigation and trial. Books were written about the case, examining it from different angles. Some authors concluded Darlie was guilty based on the evidence. Others argued she was innocent and the victim of prosecutorial misconduct and bad science. The case became a touchstone in debates about the reliability of forensic evidence, the adequacy of criminal defense for poor defendants, and the possibility of wrongful convictions in capital cases. One of the most persistent questions about the case was the issue of motive. If Darlie killed her children, why did she do it? The prosecution had suggested financial stress and resentment of motherhood, but these seemed like weak motives for such extreme violence. Millions of people experience financial stress and feel overwhelmed by parenting without murdering their children. Some people theorized that Darlie had suffered a psychotic break, a sudden and severe mental health crisis that caused her to act irrationally and violently. But there was little evidence of psychosis in Darlie's behavior before or after the murders. She had been functioning normally, caring for her children, managing her household. After the murders, she was coherent and responsive, not displaying signs of a break with reality. Others suggested that Darlie might have had undiagnosed postpartum depression or postpartum psychosis. Drake was 8 months old at the time of the murders, still within the time frame when postpartum mental health issues can occur. But again, there was little evidence that Darlie had been experiencing severe mental health symptoms before the murders. The lack of a clear, compelling motive was one of the aspects of the case that troubled many observers. Without understanding why Darlie would kill her children, it was harder to believe she had actually done it. The prosecution argued that motive wasn't required to prove, that the evidence showed what happened even if why remained unclear. But for many people, the missing motive created reasonable doubt. There was also the question of why Darlie would have killed Devon and Damon but not Drake. If she was overwhelmed by motherhood and wanted to be free of her children, why spare the youngest? If she was suffering a psychotic break, why would her violence be selective? The fact that Drake survived sleeping peacefully upstairs, while his brothers were killed downstairs, seemed inconsistent with the prosecution's theories about Darlie's state of mind and motivations. The case also raised questions about the investigation itself. Had police focused on Darlie too quickly, before thoroughly exploring other possibilities? Had they suffered from tunnel vision, interpreting every piece of evidence as supporting their theory of her guilt, while ignoring evidence that might point elsewhere? The investigation into possible intruders had been limited. Police had canvassed the neighborhood but found no witnesses who saw anyone suspicious. They had searched for physical evidence of an intruder but found none. But had they conducted a truly exhaustive investigation, or had they stopped looking once they decided Darlie was guilty? There were reports of suspicious activity in the neighborhood around the time of the murders. Some neighbors mentioned seeing a black car driving slowly through the area late at night. Others reported hearing a dog barking frantically around 2 a.m. Were these clues to an intruder's presence that were never fully investigated? The defense had tried to present evidence of possible suspects, people who might have had reason to target the Routier family, or who had a history of violence. But without concrete evidence linking any specific person to the crime, these alternative theories remained speculative. One theory that gained some traction was that the murders might have been related to Darren's business. Testnet dealt with valuable electronic equipment and components. Could someone connected to the business have targeted the family for robbery or revenge? But there was no evidence of theft from the home, and no business associates or competitors emerged as credible suspects. Another theory was that the murders were random, a crime of opportunity by someone who entered the house intending to commit burglary, and then attacked when discovered. But this theory struggled to explain the specific targeting of the children rather than the adults, the use of a knife from the house rather than a weapon brought by an intruder, and the complete absence of any physical evidence of an intruder's presence. The most controversial aspect of the trial for many observers was the use of the silly string video. Critics argued that it was prejudicial, that it inflamed the jury's emotions and led them to judge Darlie based on how she grieved, rather than on the actual evidence of whether she committed murder. They pointed out that the video showed only a few minutes of behavior, and that judging someone's guilt based on such a brief clip was fundamentally unfair. Supporters of the verdict argued that the video was relevant evidence of Darlie's state of mind and character. They maintained that while people grieve differently, the behavior shown in the video was so far outside normal bounds that it revealed something important about Darlie. Combined with all the other evidence, the video helped paint a picture of someone capable of the crime. The debate over the silly string video highlighted larger questions about what kind of evidence should be admissible in trials. Should juries be allowed to see evidence that speaks to a defendant's character or behavior if that evidence might be prejudicial? How do courts balance the probative value of evidence against its potential to unfairly bias a jury? As the years passed and Darlie remained on death row, public opinion about her case remained divided. Some people were absolutely convinced of her guilt, believing the evidence was overwhelming and the verdict was correct. They saw Darlie as a murderer who deserved her sentence and should be executed. Others believed just as strongly that Darlie was innocent, that she had been wrongly convicted based on circumstantial evidence and flawed forensic science. They saw her as a victim of a rush to judgment, a mother who had lost her children and then been falsely accused of killing them in a compounding of tragedy. Still others occupied a middle ground, uncertain about Darlie's guilt or innocence, but troubled by aspects of the investigation and trial. They felt that even if Darlie might be guilty, the evidence hadn't proven it beyond a reasonable doubt, and she shouldn't have been convicted, much less sentenced to death. The case became a subject of study in law schools and forensic science programs. It was used as an example of the challenges of prosecuting cases based heavily on forensic evidence, the importance of expert witness testimony, and the difficulties juries face in evaluating complex scientific evidence. Forensic experts continued to debate the blood spatter evidence years after the trial. Some maintained that the analysis was sound and the conclusions were valid. Others argued that blood spatter analysis was being given more certainty than the science warranted, that individual analysts could reach different conclusions from the same evidence, and that presenting such analysis as definitive proof was misleading. The Darlie Routier case also became part of broader conversations about women who kill their children. Cases like Susan Smith, who drowned her 2 sons in South Carolina in 1994, and Andrea Yates, who drowned her 5 children in Texas in 2001, raised questions about maternal filicide, mental illness, and how the justice system handles mothers accused of killing their children. The years on death row stretched endlessly for Darlie Routier. The Mountain viewed it in Gatesville, Texas became her world, a small cell where she spent 23 hours each day. The appeals process moved slowly, each motion and hearing taking months or years to resolve. Darlie maintained her innocence, writing letters, praying and clinging to hope that the justice system would eventually recognize its mistake. Drake grew up visiting his mother through glass barriers, unable to touch her, watching her age behind prison walls. Darren struggled to raise their son alone while managing crushing legal bills and the failure of his business. Darlie's mother, Darlie Key, became a tireless advocate, appearing on television programs and maintaining websites dedicated to proving her daughter's innocence. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals upheld Darlie's conviction in 2003, 6 years after her trial. This devastating decision meant the direct appeal had failed. The defense team then pursued habeas corpus proceedings, challenging the conviction on new grounds including ineffective assistance of counsel and newly discovered evidence. As forensic science advanced, new DNA testing became available. The defense hoped modern techniques would reveal evidence of an intruder that earlier testing had missed. Court approval was secured to retest key evidence from the crime scene. The testing took years, with results trickling in slowly. Unfortunately, no DNA from an unknown intruder was found. The sock still showed only Darley's and Damon's DNA. Other items yielded no usable results or matched people with legitimate reasons to be in the house. The defense also brought in new blood spatter experts who challenged the prosecution's original analysis. These experts argued that the cast-off spatter on Darley's nightshirt could have occurred without her wielding the knife. That blood spatter analysis wasn't precise enough to definitively determine who held the weapon. They suggested the blood in the kitchen sink had innocent explanations consistent with Darley's account. The habeas petition raised numerous issues: the unidentified fingerprint at the scene, the inadequate investigation of alternative suspects, the weak motive presented by prosecutors, and the failure of trial attorneys to effectively counter the state's case. Hearings were held with expert testimony and legal arguments. The prosecution vigorously defended the original trial and conviction. Public interest in the case continued through documentaries, podcasts, and online communities. People remained sharply divided. Some saw overwhelming evidence of guilt. Others believed Darley was wrongly convicted based on flawed forensic science and investigative tunnel vision. The case fell into a gray area where reasonable people could reach different conclusions from the same evidence. By the second decade of the 21st century, Darley had spent over 20 years on death row. The vibrant 26-year-old woman had aged into her late 40s under the stress of incarceration. Drake was now an adult, having grown up with a mother on death row. Darren had divorced Darley but continued supporting her appeals. The legal proceedings continued with agonizing slowness, each step taking months or years, while Darley waited for resolution that might never come. As of today, Darley Routier remains on death row in Texas, still maintaining her innocence after more than 25 years. Her case continues to generate debate and controversy, representing one of the most polarizing criminal cases in modern American history. The question of her guilt or innocence remains unresolved in the court of public opinion, even as the legal system has rendered its judgment. The evidence against Darley was substantial. The blood spatter patterns, the lack of forced entry, the staged appearance of the crime scene, the sock placed in the alley, the superficial nature of her own wounds compared to the brutal injuries inflicted on the boys. The prosecution presented a compelling case built on forensic evidence and circumstantial details that painted a picture of a mother who killed her children and tried to cover it up. Yet questions remain. The absence of a clear motive troubles many observers. The unidentified fingerprint at the scene was never explained satisfactorily. The investigation's focus on Darley may have prevented thorough exploration of other possibilities. Forensic science, particularly blood spatter analysis, is less definitive than it appeared at trial. Different experts examining the same evidence reach different conclusions. The case raises broader questions about the criminal justice system. How reliable is forensic evidence? Can expert witnesses present interpretations as certainties when the science allows for ambiguity? Does the system adequately protect against wrongful convictions in capital cases? Should the death penalty be imposed when doubt exists, even if that doubt doesn't meet the legal standard of reasonable doubt? For Darley, these philosophical questions are intensely personal. She lives each day knowing that Texas could set her execution date at any time. Her appeals continue, but the legal options are dwindling. Federal courts have shown little interest in overturning state convictions, unless constitutional violations are clear and egregious. The chances of Darley's conviction being overturned grow smaller with each passing year. Drake has had to build a life overshadowed by tragedy. He lost his brothers before he was old enough to remember them. His mother has been absent from his life, locked away on death row. The questions about what really happened that night in June 1990 6 have followed him throughout his existence. Whether his mother is a victim of injustice or guilty of unspeakable crimes, he bears the burden either way. The memory of Devon and Damon Routier deserves to be honored regardless of who killed them. 2 innocent boys, 7 and 5 years old, with their whole lives ahead of them, were brutally murdered in their own home. They died violently and terribly, victims of a crime that shocked the nation. Justice for them requires finding the truth, ensuring that the right person was held accountable. Whether that happened, whether Darlie Routier truly killed her sons, or whether the real killer remains free, is a question that continues to haunt everyone touched by this case. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this case, leave a comment and subscribe. Good night and stay safe.